Coming up, the New York Football Giants and the NFL tie a bow on the offseason, and we officially turn our attention to what to expect for Big Blue in 2024, and even take a little look back at the track record of one Joe Schoen and why year three is so critical for his regime. We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your hosts over here, Adam Armbrecht, over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise. We are ready, just about, almost, Andy, to close the door on the off season and officially put all of our attention starting on Monday towards the Vikings, towards the regular season. But before we do, where do we stand as a franchise? And do we think that this third year for the Joe Schoen Brian Daboll ticket will finally be the one when we turn a corner?
Yeah, when you think about it, you had mentioned this to me. I don't know if you mentioned it off show or not, but this is 3 off seasons that Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll have had together. Yeah. That means free agent signings, draft picks, waiver claims, all the things that we have been talking about all summer long. They have been together for those 3 years to be able to really completely overhaul this roster. And it did need an overhaul, Adam, because the reason why Dave Gettleman was fired was because it wasn't good enough under his regime. So there was cap situations that were a mess. They have to figure out the quarterback situation. They have to be more competitive in the division. And the question, rises. This is a huge season for Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll. Where are you at in terms of how things have changed over the last 3 off seasons?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because you can go into a couple of like the different signings and free agency and what's mattered the most for them, right? You go back to 2022 when he signs Mark Lewinsky. That's supposed to be like one of the stabilizing factors across the offensive line. That really doesn't pan out. He gets rid of Kadarius Toney. He turns that pick into a Darren Waller, but he ends up not panning out. But then there's other really positive things like getting Bobby Okereke and getting Brian Burns this offseason. So from a move standpoint, I think you can kind of go, 6 different ways with it and feel like, hey, he's overall found a way to improve the roster in that vein, understanding he came in at a time when the money was a mess, the books were all a disaster, and a lot of things had to be cleaned up. But I think this year, the reason why it feels pertinent to bring it up is when you enter into year number 3 and you reflect back to 2022, I think about the draft, right? Because you're not talking about some of the later round picks. Listen, Darren Beavers, the injuries, okay. Marcus McKathan, not a part of this roster. These are 5th round picks, and DJ Davidson still here, hasn't really shown a ton, but Micah McFadden, that's been a hit. He's playing alongside Bobby Okereke. Pivotal year for Dane Belton as maybe his role expands. Daniel Bellinger flashed early, needs to show that he can definitely be a contributor. And then you get into a guy like Cordell Flott. They still believe, and he came out and said he showed enough pre-injury this offseason to show that he's earned and is capable of playing that cornerback spot across from Deonte Banks. Joshua Zudu, backup swing tackle now. Like all of these things out of that 2022 draft class. And then Wan'Dale Robinson, Kayvon Thibodeau. I walked right over top of Evan Neal. No need to worry about that. But in year 3, this will become pretty cementing in terms of, was that first very full draft class when they had all these picks to start to rebuild the foundation of the team, was that successful? And you don't want to be overly judgmental after 2 years on some of these guys. Feels a little bit differently about Evan Neal maybe, but by and large, this is it. And you can walk up that next season and the draft picks in 23, and obviously the class they brought in this year, but it does feel like we're going to know. We're going to know pretty early if from a draft standpoint, Joe Schoen is putting the right footsteps forward here, because of a handful of those guys we talked about, Belton, Flott, Bellinger, as you get up that list there, if these guys turn out to not really pan out, then you're going to look back at that draft class and with Evan Neal included and say, so Kayvon Thibodeau, that was the big get here, and Micah McFadden. So I think that's where we're examining when we talk about, has Joe Schoen to this point done enough to feel confident about where the team is headed?
Yeah, and it's interesting. You mentioned some of the cap cleanup that Joe Schoen had to do. I think that is important. It's something that he has highlighted quite a bit, that like the money mattered, and he wasn't going to be one of those GMs that robbed from future New York Football Giant teams in order to pay bills that were due now. He was going to kind of take the brunt of it. And to Joe Schoen's credit, he really did clean it up, Adam. The Giants are 22nd in the league in terms of dead money. Like they're towards the back. I think they have about $24 million, $24.5 million. The Falcons have the least with $6 million. So like they're very, very low. But then you have like the win now teams that are willing to, basically cut anyone to be able to try to win. And at the top of the list, you have the Broncos with their Russell Wilson situation. You have the Vikings with the Kirk Cousins situation. Then you get into teams like the Bills and the Eagles and the Buccaneers that all made the playoffs last year. So Joe Schoen has kind of wiped the slate clean for good and for bad. But the Giants' outlook in terms of financial capabilities looks at least more promising than it did when he took over.
And certainly the Leonard Williams trade also is mixed into that bag too, right? That's one of the biggest contributors. I think it's a little north of $10 million in dead cap coming into this upcoming season off of his contract and that move to Seattle alone, which at the time, I think everyone kind of, it was, we moved on from this big contract. You didn't want to pay him. You got to pick. It was all kind of good. But then in the background, you do realize that it costs you a little bit something. And I only bring it up because that's been one of the tenets of what Joe Schoen said he didn't want to do. We have seen a little bit of that, but to your point, still closer to being better with dead cap than further away. From that standpoint, then, where do you stand? Because you brought up an interesting perspective on a one-to-one GM comp who came in the same time as Joe Schoen did, had a franchise that needed to be redirected and reconstructed on the fly. And obviously, we'll talk about the upcoming season and Daniel Jones. That was a big cornerstone of how things have gone for Joe Schoen over his first two and now third off seasons.
Yeah, obviously, we're going to talk about the team projections and what success looks like and what Vegas thinks of the team. But before we did that, I was talking to you and I said, it's really interesting. The Giants did a second round interview with Bears GM Ryan Poles, and he was very close to being hired by the Giants. I think Adam Peters was one of the guys who's now with the Washington Commanders that I know you really liked, Adam. And you had Ryan Poles, and those were basically the finalists to be the Giants GM. They got hired for their positions with Chicago and New York within a couple of days of each other. They hired new head coaches within days of each other. They had to figure out how to overturn an entire roster. Chicago was a tire fire, Adam. They didn't know what to do. He had a quarterback that he inherited, and he had to figure it out. And what I find fascinating is Joe Schoen has had a lot of cleanup, but so has Ryan Poles with the Bears. And now when you look at the trajectories of both teams, Ryan Poles has made some very, very shrewd moves. Obviously, one of the greatest trades ever in the NFL history, trading the number one overall pick to the Panthers. They still have the second round pick next year. They were able to get Caleb Williams with that pick, with the number one pick this year. They were able to move off of Justin Fields. They got DJ Moore, who's a top flight wide receiver out of all this. And all of a sudden, in the same three off seasons that Joe Schoen has had to fix the New York Giants, you look at the offense for the Chicago Bears, and you have Caleb Williams, Keenan Allen, DJ Moore, Rome Odunze. They just signed DeAndre Swift. And you're looking at it and saying, wow, the Bears are on the upswing. They have some serious promise and optimism. Would you say that you feel the same way about where the Giants are in that same time span, Adam?
No, I think it's really hard to do because of the quarterback position, right? Listen, we could boil it down to saying you chose to pay Daniel Jones that second contract, and the Chicago Bears pivoted off of Justin Fields and got themselves into a great position and traded their way around the board and then spiked Caleb Williams. And it looks like that's going to be an absolute
home run.
It's going to be, home run, franchise quarterback. Like, they are going to be competing for the division this year. And that may be the easiest way to compare them as well. Chicago is going to compete for the division in the NFC North this season. That is the expectation. Whereas the Giants will get into where is their over-under win total and what are the expectations here. And I think that you don't want to just do that one-to-one here, but there's a reality when you have the third highest cap hit in the league this year, being Daniel Jones at over $47 million. It just does remind you that, hey, when you don't have the quarterback situation figured out, that's going to really hurt you. And I think the only thing, because it's not overly negative, because those draft picks, there's a lot of things to like about what Joe Schoen has done. But I think the only thing you're going to look back at and say was the premise the Giants were so far away from being competitive, that the cap was so messed up that he walked in the door and went to John Mara, and they had an understanding this may take 3, 4, 5 years to sort out. That is typically not the timeline that NFL franchises or GMs or head coaches have, but we know that John Mara came off of every couple of years going through a coach, and coming off a bad GM. I wonder what the trajectory was in that pitch meeting and whether or not they thought they'd be here now. Remember, playoff win feels like 10 years ago now. Did that shine carry this over long enough where you think you can still get this the right way?
Yeah, it's tough. And there's two things that come to mind when you say that. One is that like it felt like the Bears got very fortunate because Carolina stunk and they gave up all the assets and they end up getting the number 1 pick. So they never necessarily like quote unquote tanked, where the Giants like almost through their fault of their own by having some early success with Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll, it's kind of created this situation where we're like, well, we thought we were really far away, but are we really that far away if we can make the playoffs and win a playoff game? There's only a handful of teams that win playoff games every year. We were one of them. And so now you kind of look at it like, where are you on this? And the one thing I want to be very clear about too is it's not about hitting on every single decision that you make as a GM. No GM does that. It hardly ever works out that way. We mentioned Ryan Poles. He traded a 2nd-round pick for Chase Claypool, who's not even in the NFL right now. And so when you
which is important. Yeah, like they always take chances and you always have misses. It's a part of it.
You want to have as many swings as you can at greatness. That's the whole idea behind this. And like while Joe Schoen has been clearing up the cap, the team is in better financial situation. Obviously, depending on how Daniel Jones plays this season, they can think about potentially moving off of him and getting the quarterback of the future. But the question is, we've mentioned the depth on the New York Giants. It still feels like there's still a ways to go. And it's like, that's why this is so important to get this thing moving in the right direction for Joe Schoen.
Yeah, 10 top 100 picks over the 3 off seasons for the Chicago Bears and Ryan Poles in terms of what they've been able to do. Multiple first-round picks, multiple second-round picks in different years as well. The New York Football Giants, though, as we say, I can sit here right now, and they had 3, 6. Guess what? Yeah, give them 11 top 10 picks over the top 100 picks, over the last 3 off seasons. And you can include picks at 112 and 114 in his incoming season, as well as this past year with 107 too. So, I mean, you can say that he had almost 15 picks in the top 120 of the NFL draft, and you need to see some of that turnover. None of this is to be overly negative. It is to set the table on. We've heard about some of these guys now coming into their 3rd seasons on the field, and even some year 2 players that have already shown up and need to continue to improve if we want this team to have an outlook for 2024 and beyond that actually feels like it's getting in the right direction. And that is why, Andy, coming up here in 1 second, we're going to turn our attention to 2024, 2025. Andy has a rundown on all of the key awards, stat lines, some betting odds we're going to talk about, all of which will help frame in how you should set your expectations for Big Blue this upcoming season. Let's dive into it coming up next. All right, Andy, you take the reins here. We wanted to frame this in a way that we can set expectations for the upcoming season. We talked about which side are we going to cover, key stat lines. The reality is, to be successful in the NFL, you need to have an offense that scores points. That's the side of the ball we're going to focus on. It also happens to be the side of the football where the Giants have not been able to manufacture any success in recent years, even while having players like Saquon Barkley.
Yeah, and so just to frame everything for everyone, early next week, we're going to talk at a high level, like how many wins the Giants are going to have. Where do we think they're going to finish in the division? We're both going to give our projections on how the division will go. But obviously, the offense is most important in terms of wanting to see significant improvement. We mentioned before, John Mara in his statement said he needs to see significant improvement. They asked Joe Schoen what that means. He didn't really have a great answer, but I know what it means. It means the offense has to play better than what it did, Adam. And Dan Duggan pointed out that with Daniel Jones starting last year, the games that he started, the Giants averaged 11.3 points per game.
I like that.
You can't win in the NFL scoring 11. You can't win in the NFL scoring 15. They need to be in the 20s in order to be successful here. And so the Giants offense has to improve. We hope that Malik Nabers is going to be part of that. We'll get to him in a second. Obviously, everything starts and ends with Daniel Jones, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is the focal point because quarterbacks are the most important position in potentially all of sports. So with Daniel Jones at the helm, Adam, I started looking at what Las Vegas projects for Daniel Jones in terms of touchdown passes and touchdown and passing yards.
Mm-hmm.
We'll start with touchdown passes. What do you think the over-under is on touchdown passes? And then where do you think Daniel Jones ends up ultimately? So I'll start with you taking a swing. How many 17 games in a season, Daniel Jones back healthy? What's the number Vegas is setting it at?
16 and a half.
Well, my friend, Vegas has it set at 14.5. So
Yeah,
they have
yeah,
it even lower than you do.
that's fine.
So my first inclination would be to say, well, you love the over for Daniel Jones then, right?
Yeah,
Is
no,
that
I
fair?
do. Yeah, I mean, I do love the over. I have him if I had to put if I put my number on it, I'd say 20, like 20 touchdowns or above is my projection for him. I'll qualify it by saying I think he misses a couple of games this season. Like you just have to kind of build that in. So I put him at playing 14, 15 games, but I have him having over 20 touchdowns on the year.
Well, so in
And let's
his
say
career,
20 or above, because maybe 20 is exactly where he lands.
yeah. So in his career, he has eclipsed 14.5 touchdowns in 2 seasons. One was obviously his rookie year when he threw for 24 touchdowns. The
Yep.
last was 2022 when they made the playoffs, albeit he only had 15 passing
Mhm.
touchdowns. But again, we hope
It
that Malik
counts.
Nabers being involved in this offense makes it a little bit more explosive. You have seen in the preseason that Daniel Jones, obviously, they're asking him to stretch the ball down the field vertically for good and for bad from what you saw in the preseason. But that number feels insanely low. But it's also very difficult because if Daniel Jones has shown that he can get hurt with the neck and the knee injuries, it's like
Of course.
maybe that number is set there not necessarily just because of his play, but you even mentioned it. He's probably going to miss a couple games. What if he misses more than a couple
Yeah.
games? Then we're probably not getting to that number.
And by the way, the 20 touchdowns, that would put him 17th last season. You had guys in that range like Geno Smith out in Seattle, Justin Herbert. And by the way, Geno Smith played in 15 games, Herbert only 13 games. So obviously his number a lot lower. Kirk Cousins in a incredibly shortened half season, essentially 18 touchdowns, 16 for Justin Fields, injuries, no longer a starter. Burrow only 10 games, 15. So I'm putting him really at the back end of guys who started and played almost all of their games. CJ Stroud, 23, 21 for Trevor Lawrence, Sam Howell in his 17 games, 21 as well. So I'm setting the benchmark at, hey, if you're mostly healthy, you miss a few games, but you are the primary quarterback for this team, you should be pushing towards that basically back end of consistent starter number at the QB spot for touchdowns.
That's kind of funny. You just mentioned CJ Stroud had 21 passing touchdowns.
That's right.
That's fascinating because Daniel Jones had 24 passing touchdowns his, rookie season, and we're talking about CJ Stroud being like the best quarterback to come up in quite a while. Like he's like a can't miss guy. I just found that number fascinating when I'm like, huh, he had
Eye
less
test goes.
touchdowns.
Eye test goes a long way, Andy.
I
Goes a
know,
long
I know.
way.
That's why you can't just read stats. But I'm like, so he had 21 passing touchdowns. It felt like the way he was talked about that it was 35 touchdowns, right? Like that's just was what I was thinking. When we flip it over to the passing yards
Oh
for
yeah.
Daniel Jones, where do you think that Vegas has him, knowing that it's only 14.5? And maybe talk to me a little bit about like where your barometer is or where you're benchmarking it in terms of like last year. You're like, oh, if he finished at X number, it would be around this yardage. That's where I think Daniel Jones would be.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume so. I'll go in like yards per game here in a second for what I think the predictions is at. But if you take a look at the NFL again, going down into that 15 to 20 range in terms of rankings, when you're at 15, you're talking about a guy throwing for almost 3,700 yards in Lamar Jackson, and we all know little guy that has won a couple of MVPs down there in Baltimore. But when you get back to 20, the 19, I should say, Russell Wilson, 3,070 yards, 15 starts playing for the Denver Broncos a year ago. And no one's going to sit here and say that was such an amazing season for Russell Wilson. But that's kind of the standard we're talking about. Behind him, it was Bryce Young in a very disappointing season for him, 2,800, almost 2,900 yards. And then Desmond Ridder, no longer a starter, playing for the Cardinals on their practice squad at 2,800 as well. So again, I'm not going to set some type of crazy gold standard for Daniel Jones. I have him throwing for over 3,000 yards. And the 17th ranked player who played 17 games, Gardner Minshew for the Colts, he threw for 3,300. So I think he's something in that range, and he's somewhere in that 18 to 16 kind of pocket of NFL quarterbacks for yardage.
If that's how you feel, then you are going to love the over-under passing yards for one
They
Daniel
must have it
Jones.
like at what, 24-ish?
26,
Okay.
25. So he
Yeah.
needs to eclipse what you mentioned Desmond Ridder did for the Falcons last year that got him onto the practice squad of the Arizona Cardinals in order for the over to hit in that one.
I'm only asking for cut practice squad yardage here. That's all that I'm asking for. It's not too big of a deal. Now, here's the interesting thing about that too, though, because the one factor inside of this. So if you go yards per game, obviously, and you got Joe, I didn't click, organized top to bottom here. Joe Flacco had the most yards per game last year in his 5 games played, 323 yards. But when you get down into it, so if I say that he only plays 14 games this season, say that Daniel Jones is going to miss 3, that means that he needs to average 220 yards passing per game in the games that he plays, missing those 3. Now, again, that still is only going to put him somewhere in the 20s, basically. You've got guys like Kyler Murray threw for 224. You got Jake Browning. He came in relief. I'm trying to find like Russell Wilson, another good example here based on his yardage. He threw for 204 last year in his 15 games. So like the only thing I'm having a hard time with is I think 3,000 yards is not unreasonable. We're going to talk about Malik Nabers, but that ends up being about 220 per game, and that would be a significant jump. And I know if there's yards per game listed there, it's obviously the 26, 25. They are not going to put him at that high of a benchmark either.
Yeah, it's really the numbers are so low. I really think Vegas is saying, are we confident that he's going to start the whole season?
And it has to be injury based here.
Yeah, is he going to get injured?
Not that we think that he's a Hall of Famer if he's healthy, but just you factor in missing 4 to 5 games, and it's going to drag the numbers down.
Right. If Russell Wilson can get to those 3,000 numbers by playing all the games, it's just like an accumulation number at that point. You would expect he gets there. Vegas is kind of hedging their bets. But Adam, if you expect Daniel Jones to go over in both of those categories, then looking for him at Comeback Player of the Year as an award might interest you. And where do you think Daniel Jones would land on that list in terms of rankings? Like where would he project?
7th or 8th, maybe, like down the list.
So he is 6th. And it's 18-1 for Daniel Jones to be the Comeback Player of the Year.
Yeah, I'm
now,
not gonna touch that.
It doesn't feel great because
I'm painting a positive picture here for Daniel Jones, and I'm not touching Comeback Player of the Year.
But he could go above touchdowns and passing yards, and the Giants could make the playoffs, and still there are other players on this list that I think, Aaron Rodgers is the number 1 for Comeback Player of the Year. If he's healthy, he has a really good chance of winning it. Joe Burrow is 2. Kirk Cousins is 3. Even guys like Anthony Richardson, who got hurt, who could flash as a year 2 guy. And then you have Nick Chubb round out the people that are in front of Daniel Jones. Yeah, it just doesn't feel like he could have a better season than what Vegas expects. And one of those other guys could lead his team to the playoffs, and Joe Burrow could be in the MVP conversation at some point. So for me, I would probably shy away from that. But I think you and I are in agreement that the only thing that's preventing Jones, in my estimation, from going over either passing touchdowns or passing yards is his health. If he stays healthy and plays these games for the Giants, there is a good chance that he gets over 3,000 yards and can get to 20 touchdowns.
Yeah, of course. Middle of the pack, man. Be a middle of the pack quarterback. Listen, in totality, I'll give him a few touchdowns rushing, maybe give him 300 to 400 rushing yards, depending on if he looks fully healthy. And he did in the preseason in terms of being mobile enough. Still can't figure out how to slide. That seems to be an interesting factor here. You know what I mean? 3,400 all-purpose yards, 24 touchdowns, getting to QBR and completion percentage as we work our way along. But that's all I'm asking for. I'm just asking to be average. And by the way, coming up here in a second, we're going to talk about the elite, now number 1 rookie in our playbook in Malik Nabers, and also the new running back there in Devin Singletary, and why I think that, those additions, especially Nabers, are going to help Daniel Jones get to the middle of the road in the NFL QB room. We'll dive into that to close out coming up next. All right, so the fun of what is Daniel Jones, what can he become, who is he as a man, and will he be the quarterback going forward for the Giants? That's all things that we'll discuss maybe after this season unfolds. Because, oh, by the way, just a little footnote. I said this to Andy off podcast. I'm saying it on podcast now. We've had this conversation. It's very interesting. When we get into the year, I will talk about if Daniel Jones had a good game or a bad game. I'll talk about the plays that were made or not made. I am not talking about whether or not it was a mistake to give Daniel Jones the contract, whether or not they should have done XYZ in the draft to get a quarterback in. That is not going to be a part of my discussion during the year because it doesn't matter. He's here. He's the quarterback. Drew Lock is the backup. And he's not going to bring up spending $5 million guaranteed on him either. So when we turn our page, though, the thing we get to be excited about is Malik Nabers. And the fact that everything he's done since being drafted has only risen his profile, including many people saying, hey, don't be surprised if he's challenging Marvin Harrison Jr. as ending up being the best overall wide receiver taken.
Yeah, I mean, I think also the reason why we feel positive about Daniel Jones going over on some of these metrics is because they finally got Malik Nabers.
Of course.
And, we feel like the offensive line is improved. That will allow Daniel Jones time to get the ball to such a special playmaker in a guy like Malik Nabers. And so, what I wanted to start with is there are some high expectations for a rookie, Adam. They obviously unretired, the first jersey ever retired in the history for a guy that's never even played a snap in the NFL. I know that's not something you love to talk about, but man, did it set Twitter and X ablaze yesterday. But the expectations could not be higher for Malik Nabers. And so knowing that, we look to Vegas to find out exactly what Vegas projects for Malik Nabers this year. And so let's start out with those touchdowns that we mentioned Daniel Jones was going to throw. How many of those do you think Vegas thinks are going to be thrown to Malik Nabers this year?
I'm going to put him at, this is going to be high, but I'm going to put him, I'll say 6.5, and I bet it's like a touchdown lower.
Well, you can bet even more because they only have it at 4.5 right now. Adam. So
Jeez.
the question is, can Malik?
What an embarrassment, Vegas.
Can you get Malik 5 touchdowns? Can he average 1 touchdown every 3 games?
What's the number on that? What's the number on that?
What do you mean?
What are the odds on that?
Oh, it's -150. So it is a little bit of Vegas.
No. Everyone will learn if you haven't been with the show. I don't like it unless it's really wetting my beak on some long odds.
I'm sure that you can get some alternate odds for him to score like 8 touchdowns, and then that's where you start to get interested. But basically, we need Malik Nabers to score 1 touchdown every 3 games and change. You're like, man, even if Daniel Jones got hurt and it was Drew Lock or Tommy DeVito, like, don't you feel like every few games Malik's talent is just going to get him into the end zone?
Well, and by the way, if I said 6.5 touchdowns as being the benchmark, you put yourself basically the top 28 wide receivers in terms of touchdowns. That's the threshold there. Rashee Rice, he had 7 last year, and then you get the 29th, which is actually tight end in George Kittle with his 6. So, I mean, I'm talking about being in that top 30 in terms of touchdown categories, and everyone from 7 all the way up to when you get into the top 5 in the elite of the elite 10, right? So, I mean, there's, it's a finite number of wide receivers that have double digit. It's only Mike Evans, Tyreek Hill, CeeDee Lamb, Cortland Sutton, which everyone would have known would have been in there as well. Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? So, the group of guys that are going to be mentioned there. And obviously Justin Jefferson will be in that more often than not too. So I'm setting a relatively high goal, but you are the number one option on this team. And we can talk about targets and talk about yardage and all these other elements. There's just, I find it impossible for Malik Nabers not to have over 5, let alone saying like maybe 6 is my benchmark, but 5+ touchdowns has to be the goal here. If not, it's going to be a disappointment, and you're probably going to have, understandably, a frustrated rookie wide receiver who feels like he's ready to explode.
Yeah, I mean, Darius Slayton had 4 touchdowns last year in an offense that couldn't move the ball. Right. And that's not a knock on Darius Slayton. That's just like the reality of him being one of the better wide receivers that was available on the roster. Got to 4 with middling quarterback play and horrific offensive line play. If the offensive line is improved and Daniel Jones is improved and Malik Nabers is who we think he is, this feels like an even better wager than maybe even some of the Daniel Jones stuff that we talked about. But I know, Adam, you've also made some comments about Malik Nabers' yardage in terms of him being able to get the ball and be elite and maybe start pushing towards record-breaking numbers. So where do you think Malik Nabers could be in his rookie season in terms of receiving yards?
I'm calling for him to be a 1,000-yard receiver. Like that's what I'm calling for. If you go in and you look at targets alone, right? So just talking from a target standpoint, anybody that is anywhere near the top 50, basically, top 42, 100 targets for Justin Jefferson, who only played in 10 games, by the way. So imagine what that number would have been if he was there for the entire season. And then everybody else is over 90, by the way, inside of that top 50. Inside of this offense, as the first number 1 wide receiver they've had in years, Daniel Jones, I expect him to be much closer to top 20 in terms of targets. That puts him in the range of a Chris Godwin, 130, Terry McLaurin, 132. So in the 130s in terms of targets. All of those guys are 1,000-yard receivers in that range. And you can make a case that at least at this point of their career, or based on what we think Malik Nabers is going to be, that Malik Nabers is a better wide receiver, let's say, than Adam Thielen, who took 137 targets, of great veteran wide receiver, had an amazing career, 103 catches for 1,014 yards. Like, I'm going to put him in the mix for that. DeAndre Hopkins did it on 137 targets with 75 catches, turned it into 1,057. Like, he actually might be a really interesting benchmark to put there as like a stat comparison. 75 on 137, 1,057 yards, 7 touchdowns. Like, that might be the line there, and that makes him a top 20 wide receiver. That's pretty much where I think all of his numbers should be in terms of catches, targets, yardage, and touchdowns. That's what I believe Malik Nabers can be, and what he frankly has to be this year for the Giants.
Yeah, I think the line opened up at 850 yards for Malik Nabers. It's already up to 900. It's already up to 900.
Right.
It's been moved up because the hype has been real in camp. It's like, just get that man the ball. Me personally, the yardage, you feel like you should be able to get to 1,000, but I don't know how much of a passing offense. Like, are they really going to open this thing up, or with the improved line, are they going to run the ball, more frequently? Are they just going to manage the game? I don't know.
No, stop it.
I personally like over 4.5 touchdowns more than I like the over of 900 yards. I feel like getting to 5 touchdowns, it feels a little easier than getting to 1,000 yards, but maybe I'm just not thinking about the stat accumulation numbers in my head. But
Sure.
yeah, I think I like the 4.5. It sounds like you feel like 1,000 is what the expectation should be anyway for a number one type wide receiver. So so surprisingly, I'd probably shy away from the yardage, would be in on the touchdowns. But either way, 1,000 yards with touchdowns that put you in the top 30 in the wide receiver puts you in the potential of getting to the offensive rookie of the year. And so where do you think Malik Nabers would be ranked, or where do you think his odds are in terms of that award?
Yeah, well, you got to take whatever, how many quarterbacks were there, right? There's at least 3 in the top. I don't know if we're going to get Bo Nix action this year, but he can't be more than somewhere in like the 7 to 10 range, I guess, maybe something like that. Maybe a
So
little bit
he
lower
is
than
sixth, just like
6.
Daniel
Okay,
Jones
yeah.
is sixth in the comeback player of the
Is
year.
he over every other wide receiver?
No. So Marvin Harrison Jr. is the third ranked offensive rookie of the year, and his odds are only, Marvin Harrison is plus 650. So throw down
I mean,
$100.
listen, you talk about whatever Kyler Murray is or is not, but when you have a quarterback who's proven that he can do those things, then it makes it a lot easier to look at the wide receiver, right?
Yeah. So it's Marvin Harrison, then it's the 4 quarterbacks: Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Bo Nix, and Drake May. Even though Drake
Oh.
May is not starting week 1, still has better odds to win offensive rookie of the year than Malik Nabers. Malik Nabers is 6th, and he is 18-1, Adam. So when you talk about those long shots and those long odds, if Malik Nabers gets over 1,000 yards and gets to the 7 or 8 touchdowns, he's going to be in the mix. It usually goes to a quarterback, and if we mentioned GM Ryan Poles getting Caleb Williams and the Bears, he is almost even money odds-on favorite to make it. You'd think if he ends up bringing the Chicago Bears to the playoffs, that's a shoe-in for a quarterback award. But remember, if Malik Nabers pops and he is exciting and he plays in New York and all of a sudden the franchise feels like they have a positive action, these types of awards are all about narratives. Do you think that Malik Nabers could build up enough narrative playing in New York and being exciting and maybe conjuring up Odell Beckham, feelings from the fan base and the media to be able to have a shot at this?
Probably not unless you're talking about the team and the wins, right? I mean that there has to be a correlation there. And I guess if we're just talking about it like in terms of the overall spectrum, you would need Caleb Williams to be good but not great, have some stumbling, maybe you don't expect them to. Like you need the quarterbacks to come down to earth in order for it to make this path for a rookie. And then you're talking about like what's the highest rookie season totals for wide receivers? I'm trying to remember because you probably would have to be in that territory to have these other rookie quarterbacks playing pretty well and be a wide receiver kicking in that door.
So last year, Puka Nacua broke the
Right.
record for the most receiving yards by a rookie with 1,486 yards, which is a huge number. He supplanted Groman, which I immediately have no idea who that is. And then number 3 and number 4 are Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson on the rookie list. They all had over 1,400 yards receiving. So it feels like for Malik to be in that category and to usurp one of the quarterbacks that could have a good year, he probably needs to get into that top 5, if not break Puka Nacua's record and get 1,500 receiving yards, which would be probably a little bit of a stretch here.
And again, think about it. Imagine if we were talking about Malik Nabers with Kyler Murray in Arizona, right? Name other teams where he could be. Right now, it obviously is very dependent on Daniel Jones and how the QB position plays. I think that's 1-to-1 our expectations for him. I get to go ahead and put it down official, though. I'm going 80 catches, 1,100 yards, and 7 touchdowns for our boy, wearing number 1 in your playbook, number 1 in your heart. That's going to be my gold standard for him. And I think he can achieve it even with, again, average play. It just basically means that when opportunities knock, the Giants and Daniel Jones need to be looking for their most electric weapon. And it's interesting because we're not going to get to Devin Singletary today. When we go into next week, we're going to turn our attention over to the Minnesota Vikings. But we still have the win total, which is set at 6.5. Like, what are our expectations? As we work our way through the season, we'll remind you, it was set at 6.5. Are they picking up a win this week? Like, where do we think they're going to be? But I wonder about the dynamic of this offense. You kind of mentioned it as we were going through here. And really ties back to the top. How secure is Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll in their jobs? Because if they're secure in them, and Brian Daboll specifically, then you call the plays that you want. You call the plays that are supposed to be successful. You call the plays that help you win games. If you maybe don't feel like you're so secure in your job, then you may end up being a little bit tentative in terms of how risky do you want to be on a game-to-game basis. And I think threading that needle of being a slow plotting offense, not going deep too often because of the risk of what maybe Daniel Jones will hit or not hit on those shots, then you'll just find yourself, I think, in the old slow bleed category when it comes to winning or losing football games over the year. You got to take your shots. You got to be explosive. You got to expose your defense and say, yeah, man, we may give up some points and we're going to come right back and fire it off. The goal for this team this season should be an offense that goes after it. For better or worse, results be damned. When we step onto the field every drive, we are going to use every weapon we have. We have 3 receivers in the first, second, and third round. We have the weapons and improved offensive line. Go after and get it. And if Daniel Jones succeeds and it looks like his rookie year, fantastic. If he fails, spike a high pick and look at quarterbacks like that. I just think you need to not worry about what is going to be the after season discussion about this team. All you can do is walk in every single week, starting with Vikings week 1 and say, hey, how are we going to win this game? Probably going to need to put up some points. Let's get after it.
At the end of the day, Adam, we mentioned that this team has to be better on offense. 11.3 points per game with Daniel Jones isn't going to cut it.
11.3 points.
It's nauseating to be able to even say those numbers. But Adam, when you look at the yards per attempt and the air yards per attempt, Daniel Jones has some of the lowest in the league. He's averaging yards per attempt is 5.7. As an example, Drew Lock in his last 2 seasons averaged 7.1 yards per attempt, significantly more than Daniel Jones. And so when you look at those numbers, like, yeah, you got to find a way to stretch the ball vertically. We hope that an improved offensive line and a bona fide number 1 superstar in a guy like Malik Nabers is going to allow the Giants to do that. Daniel Jones, stay healthy. Brian Daboll, call the plays that you want, stretch the field vertically, and get the ball in Malik Nabers' hands so that all of the predictions that Adam has put out there end up coming to fruition.
15.6 points per game. That was the New York Football Giants last year. And I don't need to blow your socks off here. They were only better than New England Patriots and the Carolina Panthers in that category. You want to have a season.
Is that good?
Yeah, 2 of the other terrible offenses.
The 2 teams that had the number 1 and the number 3 pick in the draft. Is that good? Is that good?
Not a big deal. All worked out in the end. If you want to be into that discussion, then you need to jump up and start talking about yourself being in that, top, not 20, but top 22-ish. Give me, and it's not even a lofty goal here. Give me 19 to 21 kind of points, and you can start to be in that discussion of being in more football games. Only the elite of the elites are scoring up in the 29 and almost 30. Dallas Cowboys, Miami Dolphins, 49ers. We're not those teams. But can we be teams like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, like the Denver Broncos, like the Chicago Bears from last year, right? That's the conversation you want to get into. So hopefully, again, next week, man, we have an entire layout for how Monday through Friday is going to go each and every week for you. We're going to break down every aspect, not only of the New York Football Giants, but also of our opponent, the Minnesota Vikings. What were their key additions? Where are their biggest threats? Where can we win? Where could we lose against them? Setting up the table all week long so that you have all of that action ready for you on Sundays. Be sure to get over to YouTube at One Giant Podcast. Turn on the alerts, going live at least once a week, every week, just for you. And also over on those podcast feeds, man, leave the 5-star review. Please subscribe. It means a great deal to us. Check out our sponsors as well. And until next time, until the season's time, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.